On the morning of Sunday, February 22, 2026, the hills around Tapalpa in the Mexican state of Jalisco were unusually quiet for a weekend. Farmers got up, coffee was brewed, and people went about their usual routines. But that calm was about to be shattered. Long before most residents were awake, helicopters began hovering in the skies, and armored vehicles rumbled down narrow dirt roads. Mexican security forces were preparing for one of the most important operations in the country's recent history: to capture or kill Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. El Mencho was one of the most wanted men in the world. The United States government had placed a $15 million bounty on his head, and Mexican authorities had declared him one of the most dangerous drug lords in the country. For years, he had stayed hidden from security forces while leading an organization responsible for trafficking huge amounts of drugs, including fentanyl, methamphetamine, heroin, and cocaine, into the United States and other countries. His cartel was known for violence, intimidating tactics, and the ability to strike both police and civilians with little warning. By the middle of the day, soldiers from Mexico's elite forces had moved into position near a suspected hideout in the rugged terrain of Jalisco. They had been carefully tracking the cartel movements for weeks, piecing together secret information about El Mencho's circle. But when the operation began, it erupted into chaos. Gunmen loyal to the cartel opened fire on the approaching soldiers. Automatic rifles cracked and rumbled as helicopters circled overhead. It was a dangerous life-or-death situation for everyone involved. Several members of El Mencho's security detail were killed in the initial firefight. Some soldiers were wounded, but they fought back and continued advancing. The sounds of explosions and gunfire echoed through the hills, mixing with the thick dust that rose whenever armored vehicles drove across the rough ground. Local villagers, hearing the battle from miles away, watched from safe distances, unsure of what was happening but sensing that something big had just begun. At some point during the clash, soldiers found El Mencho. He was wounded and quickly placed into a military helicopter, bound for a secure medical facility in Mexico City. But he did not survive the flight. Before he could reach medical care, he died from his injuries, ending years of pursuit by security forces in Mexico and the United States. News of his death spread around the world almost immediately.
All of this started this morning after a Mexican military operation killed the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel named Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, also known as El Mencho,
shocking many who had followed the cartel conflict for years. Even as Mexican authorities confirmed El Mencho's death, chaos began to unfold across the country. In Guadalajara, Mexico's second-largest city and located less than 2 hours from Tapalpa, roads became blocked by burning buses and trucks. Thick black smoke rose over highways as cartel members set vehicles on fire to send a message to authorities and to slow down any military response. Videos posted on social media showed soldiers trying to move through the streets, while huge flames and plumes of smoke made it difficult for commuters to go about their day. In the coastal resort city of Puerto Vallarta, the situation quickly turned frightening for tourists. People staying in beach hotels heard the roar of helicopters overhead and saw smoke in the distance. Authorities were overwhelmed as travelers looked for ways to get home or to find shelter. Major airlines, including American, Delta, United, and Mexico's Aeromexico, canceled flights to the region as the unrest continued. Airport workers escorted panicked passengers across runways, and many tourists hid in hotel rooms waiting for word that the chaos had ended. But this violence wasn't limited to Jalisco and Puerto Vallarta. Within hours, unrest and clashes were reported in at least 9 Mexican states, including Michoacán, Guanajuato, Veracruz, and Tamaulipas. Cartel members hijacked buses and trucks, setting them ablaze on major highways to block security forces. In some areas, bridges and roads were completely blocked, forcing residents to find alternate routes or remain trapped in their towns. What began with a military raid in the hills had quickly spread into a nationwide reaction. The governor of Jalisco declared a state of emergency, suspending public transportation and urging citizens to stay inside until the situation could be controlled. 21 major highways were reported blocked by burning vehicles. Schools across several states canceled classes for the next day, concerned about student safety. Families scrambled to get home before nightfall, and local authorities worked overtime to try to restore order amid the chaos. The U.S. Embassy in Mexico issued a formal security alert for American citizens in several states, telling them to shelter in place and avoid travel, while Canada and the United Kingdom issued similar warnings to their citizens. Taxi services and ride-sharing apps were suspended in major cities, as drivers were afraid to navigate streets where gunfire and burning vehicles had been reported just hours earlier. By the next morning on Monday, February 23rd, soldiers and National Guard units began patrolling streets and highways that were once blocked. Cleanup crews worked to remove burned buses and cars. In Guadalajara, the scene was calmer than the day before, but the marks of violence remained on highways and bridges. Reports began to emerge that a number of civilians and several Mexican soldiers had been injured during the unrest, though exact numbers were slow to come in amid the ongoing security operations. To understand the depth of the reaction, it helps to know who El Mencho was. He was born in rural western Mexico in the 1960s. In his early life, he spent time working as a police officer before turning fully to crime. In the late 1980s, he crossed into the United States and lived in California, but was arrested on drug charges and deported back to Mexico. After a second arrest in the early 1990s, he again returned to Mexico. And instead of leaving crime behind, he began building connections in the underworld. By 2011, after alliances shifted within Mexico's larger cartel landscape, El Mencho helped form the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. From its early days, CJNG pushed boundaries that most criminal groups had not. They acquired armored vehicles, heavy weapons, and sophisticated communications tools. They used drones to monitor rivals and even to drop explosives. Their fighters were extremely well-armed and well-trained, sometimes using military-style tactics that made them especially dangerous. This was not just a group of traffickers moving drugs. It was a militarized criminal network that could take on state forces. Over the years, CJNG was connected to some of the deadliest clashes with Mexican security forces. In 2015, they ambushed a convoy of state police in Jalisco, killing 15 officers and injuring many more. Later, they shot down a military helicopter in another violent confrontation, killing 9 personnel, one of the first times organized crime had used such heavy weaponry against government forces. These attacks shocked the nation and pushed successive Mexican presidents to focus heavily on stopping the cartel. But perhaps the most significant impact of El Mencho and his organization came not from direct confrontations, but from the fentanyl crisis. Under his leadership, CJNG became one of the main sources of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid far stronger than heroin, flooding American communities. This drug was linked to tens of thousands of overdose deaths in the United States. Many families lost children, parents, and siblings to pills that looked like legitimate medicine, but contained tiny, lethal doses of cartel-produced poison. Fentanyl became a public health disaster, and law enforcement in the U.S. repeatedly called CJNG one of the biggest threats to safety in North America. El Mencho himself rarely appeared in public. For years he avoided photos and videos, surrounded by layers of trusted lieutenants and protected by a network that moved him constantly to avoid detection. His ability to remain hidden for so long frustrated authorities and made his eventual death a historic event, but it also raised concerns about what would come next. On Tuesday, February 24th, as calm slowly returned to the streets and highways reopened, security analysts began debating the future. Some believed that killing El Mencho would weaken CJNG and reduce violence. Others worried that removing a strong leader could create a power vacuum, leading to even more fighting as rival commanders and competing organizations tried to take control. In other cartel cases, when a leader was removed, internal feuds and clashes often increased, and violence spread. Families who had suffered from cartel violence had mixed reactions. Some expressed relief that El Mencho was gone and hoped it would mean a future with less crime and death. Others, however, were not optimistic. They worried that more violence could follow as the cartels scrambled to reorganize. And beyond Mexico's borders, U.S. officials pointed out that as long as there was demand for fentanyl and other drugs, traffickers would find ways to supply them. By the end of Tuesday, airports that had been closed due to the unrest began resuming flights. Tourists in Puerto Vallarta who had spent the night in hotels or shelters slowly began to emerge, hugging their families and breathing sighs of relief as normal routines resumed. In Guadalajara, cleanup crews worked to clear burned barricades, and markets began to open again. Soldiers and police continued to patrol strategic points, reminding citizens that the situation, while calmer, was still fragile. But even as life returned to something close to normal, the questions remained. Would CJNG stay united under new leadership? Would rival cartels try to take over territory? Could Mexico and the United States finally make real progress against a drug war that had lasted decades? The death of El Mencho was one chapter closing in a long, complex story, but it was far from the end.